Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue our conference with our panel on social and individual aspects of eccentric expositions in Anglo-American literature. We have three more guests in this session. Our first presenter is Taylan Paksoy. He was born in 1987 and raised by two educated parents according to the principles of Turkish Enlightenment. After completing his high school education, he has majored in French language and literature at the University of Ankara. Yet his intellectual endeavors led him to focus on Anglo-American literature. Therefore, Taylan decided to attend the Department of American Culture and Literature at Ege University. Since then, he has been pursuing to apprehend the dynamics of English-speaking world through its poetry, history, and political thought. To achieve his objectives, he successfully attended Georgetown University's 2012 summer school in Greece and became an alumni of TUVAS International, having the honor and chance of being lectured by accomplished academicians such as Anthony Sullivan and Professor Michels. Moreover, he participated in many conferences and symposiums, including ISLC and EAS, etc. After completing his BA, he had intended to get an MA on international politics. The title of his paper is Milton Blake Pound's Oracles of Anglo-Atlantic Civilization.
Hello everybody, I salute you all. I start with thanking my friends at Bilkent University and also my family. I will start with a quotation from Herodotus. I cannot deny that there is truth in prophecies. To apprehend the insanity within Anglo-American literature, it is imperative to trace grandiose delusion of John Milton, William Blake, Ezra Pound, and its overwhelming odor within their respectable works, Paradise Lost, Europe a Prophecy, and the Peasant Cantos. Since these three figures and their works chronically expose the major material and mental dysfunction of their very own culture in three peculiar stages of its progress, it is vital to envisage and examine their contributions to apprehend many maladies which haunt existing global perception. Milton witnessed the birth of a new British identity wrapped in the newly acquired fabric of Judeo-Christian capitalism with his blind eyes. Blake wrote with angels among the newly erected funnels of rapidly industrializing London and warned us about an unknown phenomena of alienation. Ezra Pound oversaw the supposed fall of Western culture on the zenith of its self-destruction, which historians termed as World War II. Moreover, the way each poet expressed their formidable psyche would most probably breach the current boundaries of modern psychology. Milton is widely known as an ardent misanthrope who spent his life between stressful political struggle and pessimistic seclusion. Blake reported many bizarre hallucinations, which he calls visions beginning with his childhood, and Pound was a flamboyant psychotic and catatonic, according to the reports of his fellow American captures. Thus, a meticulous analysis is required to present literary and historical examples of insanity in Anglo-American context. To start with, christened as the connoisseur of 17th century British literature, John Milton hails the audience with a profound biblical imagery. And his spectre, which transpires out of it, flows over an important period of transformation in British history. Born to an upper middle class Protestant family in London, Milton had the chance to access London's literary circles from an early age. At the age of 15, he already mastered Greek and Latin, and composed his first sonnets. At the age of 17, he had his BA. Thus, his obsessively studied nature and extensive contacts with the enlightened but twisted intelligentsia enabled him to perfectly apprehend the spirit of his homeland. Yet Milton did not content himself with it and mounted on a grand tour, which lasted from 1538 to 1539 and will be imitated by his successors amongst the gargantuan pillars of Western culture, respectively France and Italy. There he met iconic figures of enlightenment such as Galileo and forged his authentic discernment of the European culture. Upon his return, he found his country entangled with religious upheaval and political conflict caused by malign spiritual spiritual disorder rooted in the previous Tudor century. Having understood the ancient dichotomy of republic versus empire and witnessed the corruption of Stuart autocracy, he immediately took his stance with the parliamentary cause by pamphleting rigorously on republican and anti-clerical ideals. During this period of socio-political depression, Milton also experienced a personal depression in form of a marital problem, and his 16-year-old bride, Mary Powell's abandonment, left him emotionally damaged and altered his moral perception. Following the parliamentary triumph, he was designated as the Secretary of Foreign Talk in the Cromwellian administration, an euphemistic name for the Minister of Propaganda in the new Commonwealth of Britain, and became responsible of censorship, contradicting with his previous positions. But to the disappointment of Milton, now proclaimed as the Lord Protector, Cromwell turned increasingly autocratic, and Milton lost his eyesight, just as the Commonwealth lost his foresight by betraying its republican principles. Inevitably, restoration of Stuart autocracy followed the strongman Oliver Cromwell's death, and Milton, now a traitor, whose writings were to be burned by a royal edict, went into a stressful hiding, only to be arrested and briefly imprisoned. After being freed, he retreated from the political arena, afflicted by both physical and mental scars. During his relatively quiet last decade of his life, he architected his masterpiece, Paradise Lost, a monumental piece among the epic tradition. Paradise Lost stands as a foremost literary attack on 17th century conventional values. Milton, with his vast knowledge of Christian theology, based his blank verse epic on the Judeo-Christian creation myth Genesis. He delved into the Old Testament and altered the dogma by reshaping the biblical hierarchy carefully. By doing this, he achieved to inject his religious perspective into the Anglo-Atlantic mindset, just as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John succeeded a spherical one long ago. His personal divineship manifested itself when he rectified universal roles. He offered us an impersonal God, a God whose ethereal omnipotence cannot be qualified simply as black and white. Mankind's nemesis Satan steps in, and morning star is no more an enemy, but a noble rebel, whose rebellion is an undetachable part of God's plan. First Patriarch Adam willingly follows the first matriarch Eve in her manifesting on the apple out of his dignity. And in the grand finale, Milton reminds the audience of the both theirs and Adam's tentative existence. Still, Milton restores hope and faith in humanity when he arrogantly recreated Adam. This brand new Adam joyfully accepts his fate, having understood that only by admitting the non-existence of self lets ultimate self to exist. Thus, Milton's wisdom surpassed any psychiatric diagnosis while replacing him amongst Jung's archetypal gallery as a sage. Eventually, his bright faith in the human being as an entity penetrates idolatrous insanity of his age, and Milton succeeds in passing the fire of spiritual as well as political rebellion to his successors in literature. William Blake follows this blazing line of literary insurgency, full of angst, from a very different path in a very different era. One of the vanguards of the spontaneous romanticism, he opened his eyes in a lower-class radical household in Soho, unlike well-to-do Milton, who espoused more systematic approach. Moreover, he educated himself in his early youth and learned through apprenticeship and self-education. And it was during that period that he started reporting hallucinations, or visions as he styled them. At last, at the age of 21, he was accepted into Royal Academy, where he came to struggle against the hypocritical formalism of Academy's president Joshua Reynolds. But it was there, during his time in Royal Academy, he developed a taste for general insurrection and the tendency for regicide, just as Milton. His controversial role in the anti-Catholic Gordon riots still is a matter of debate. Yet, his obvious anti-autocratic and egalitarian approach displays itself through his illuminated canon. Besides his disgust of Georgian-era empire building, an apparent victory of commerce over the traditional values provoked him dearly. Thus, he made acquaintances with the prominent, even glorious radical intellectuals, such as Thomas Paine, who was one of the chief ideologues of first British and then American radicalism, and also Mary Wollstonecraft, a Puritan feminist and defender of universal sexual equality. Hence, he was able to couple his revolutionary animus with an anima which stands tall above oppressive gender misconceptions. Onwards, he came to be contacted by various mystical groups from the Grand Lodge of England to Swedenborgian society and repeatedly experimented with eccentric practices. His life provided him with an aura of transcendence that blossoms within a self-created pantheon envisaged by his visionary state. But his naive state has an enormous flaw. It has a potential to be cynically labeled as heresy back then by bigots, but today it is quite worse. Because a person in Blake's condition may be diagnosed with psychosis even by an ordinary Freudian shrink. Still, it would be unwise to underestimate Blake's message and his role as a messenger. In his self-claimed prophetic works, Europe a Prophecy and the following America a Prophecy, he felt the grasp of the overwhelming conformism and materialism in the British society, which would be gradually imposed upon the world, first by an immense empire, it's called British Empire, and then by a shallow quasi-empire, it's called United States of America. Yet, what he terribly experienced and reported was a contagious phenomenon, which is the source of any psychological malady called alienation. He died peacefully after singing chants and verses, breaking all the vestiges of alienation, at least individually. Ezra Weston Loomis Pound, the Bard of Alienation, continued within Blake's last hymns after 58 years when he started breathing, not in London, but in the wild northwestern Idaho territory across the Atlantic. He was raised according to the Republican values by intellectually well-established Pound family, as he had moved to the States in his early childhood. But even in his childhood, he was determined to become a poet. Luckily, he crossed the Atlantic soon after to accumulate enough knowledge through experience. At the age of 13, his voyage surpassing Milton's grand tour, excluding France, including England, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, granted him a supreme grasp not only on Anglo-Atlantic culture. Besides, his interest in Sufi poetry, Vedas, and haiku is also evident within the framework of his literary development. As an expatriate, he moved to London in the last years of his adolescence, and during this period, he enjoyed the company and tutorship of literary titans such as J. Joyce and William Butler Yeats. What he witnessed during the World War I caused a trauma, which eventually drove him out of London, filled with rage against Anglo-American financial system based on war profiteering, which will eventually lead the world into a passive-aggressive nuclear stalemate in the following decades. And such, he lost his faith in his nature values. It was the other expatriates of another generation, such as Hemingway and Eliot, with whom Pound accomplished more subtle intellectual partnership during his stay in Paris. Then his unstable family life and worsening physical and psychological condition led him to the warmer and a little fascistic climate of Italy, where he started his incomplete magnum opus de cantos. His choice of residence positioned him on the defeated and therefore wrong side of the war. Although he demanded repatriation after Pearl Harbor, he remained in Italy until its destruction by the Allied war machine, captured by partisans in the failing Nazi puppet state of Salo. He was handed over to his fellow American compatriots and forced to live in a cage for 3 weeks, reminding us of Guantanamo victims. Forced to sleep on the ground, where he also defecated. Pizan Cantos exuberantly sprouted with a serious nervous breakdown. Started on a toilet paper, Pizan Cantos bears the mark of Pound's already fertilized substructure. While writing it, Insanity of War devoured the spiritus mundi and much of the earth with dozens of oppressive regimes motivated by three ideological anomalies called Stalinism, Fascism, and corporate capitalism. Valuing the space and its reflection, Pound enriched lines with an aggregate of imagery. Furthermore, he also carefully intervened a myriad of archetypes such as demigods and historically significant characters. Out of his nerve-breaking, entangled labor came an enigmatic masterpiece, as well as an unheard lament for the destruction of traditional Western values by virtually insane statesmen, bankers, academicians, but also poets. After completing Peace and Cantos, he returned to post-war Italy upon being released from the war. He died in 1972, joining Milton and Blake. Pound was harmoniously buried near Stravinsky to spend his wedding with eternity, accompanied by crazy Russian composers' suites. His legacy burns bright, yet his was the last integrated stance against the nose mundi. Pound, to sum up. Pound, Blake, and Milton are the three names pronounced by many times by men and women. Their visions and psychotic experience also shared by them, and they form a literary triumvirate which still has a command on thousands of dangerously young minds. Insanity sometimes manifests itself vividly, even hypnotically in their lives, but their socio-political environments and its current direction proves to be more horrid. But during reactionary restoration, Milton was qualified as an aberrant heretic. During Imperial Georgian era, Blake was considered as a delusional libertine. Today, on the edge of golden scales, in or post-20th century paranoia, Pound is being condemned as a loony fascist. Unsurprisingly, corruption, they pointed out, is not only rooted in the depths of the globe, but also on the shallow quagmire of mediocre educational institutions, so that they are still being considered as fanatics with problems. Yet all these attempts to stereotyping these figures backfired in this rapidly polarizing world of constant conflict. Therefore, their profound contribution still pierces any curtain on the collective subconsciousness by staging the truth of it. Thank you.
Thank you for your paper, Taylan. Now, our second speaker in this session is Aysem Öktem. She's from Çanakkale and 21 years old. She works for a private company as a translator. In 2009, she made a presentation on the effects of the psychology of the writers on literature in her high school. Today, she will present a paper named Writers in Their Texts, Fyodor, Dostoyevsky, and Halide, Adıvar. She will discuss the effects of Dostoyevsky's life on his works and the influence of society on Halide, Adıvar's works. Now let us hear from Aysem.
Distinguished guests, friends, and my family. I'm Aysem Öktem from Çanakkale 18 Mart University. Today I will present a brief paper on the relationship between psychology and literature. My paper consists of three parts. The first part is about the relationship between psychology and literature in general. The second part is about the relationship between Dostoyevsky's life and his works. I will talk about the effects of his life and his works. I will talk about the final part is about Halide, a Turkish writer. She reflects in her works her own philosophy, the political structure, and the value of the society she lives in. I will give examples from her work entitled Sinekli Bakkal. Before starting my presentation, I want to ask a question to you. Do you think that is there any effect of writer's psychology on the text of literature?
Yes. Could you repeat the question, please? Could you repeat your question?
Okay. Do you think that is there any effects of writer's psychology on the text of literature?
Definitely, surely.
As a whole? It does. I think not as a whole, but some. Thank you for your answering. Let's start with the first part. These are texts are created by writers who reflect some of their inner worlds. That is their psychology. It is just that we have to investigate these clues with correct methods. Texts of literature give information to us about human works. Novels which focus on psychology tend to analyze these works. These analyses can help us understand certain people's thoughts and comments on events. We shouldn't forget literary texts are created by reconstructing the real life. So in daily life, you can see similarities between the real world and people in literary works. Second part, I will start with the effects of Dostoyevsky's life on his works, and I will continue displaying the relationship between his life and his most popular work, Yağmur. Dostoyevsky is one of the most powerful representatives of the psychological realism. Let's start with the relationship between Dostoyevsky's life and his text of literature. There are two groups in this part. Group A is examination of the process of creating the text. Group B is examination of the psychology of the writers. These works in Group A, you can see these works, are an attempt to show the impact of his disease, he was an epileptic, on the formation of his work. Also, his habit of gambling became so traumatic in his life that the difficulties he has to face as a gambler became an inspiration in the writing of some of his novels. These works in Group B show us some events in his life. For instance, The Eternal Husband was written after his wife's death. We can see his sadness deeply in this work. The other example is A Writer's Diary, which shows us his shock because of his daughter's death. Gambler by Dostoyevsky. In his work, like The Gambler, Dostoyevsky writes about the human issues, the human nature, and as well as human reality. The Gambler reflects instances of his life, but on the whole, it is not an autobiographical novel. So this work sheds light only on one part of the writer's life, the passion of gambling. I will be dealing with the similarities between the life of Dostoyevsky and the gambler, and also how he changed the real figures and actual events in the life. Let's start with the relationship between characters in The Gambler and characters in Dostoyevsky's life. First one, there are some similarities between Dostoyevsky and Alexis. For instance, Alexis is the teacher of General's son, and he meets Polina thanks to his occupation. Dostoyevsky is the teacher of the Istevay's son. He meets Marie Istevay, who was the first wife of him, thanks to his occupation too. The other example is that both Alexis and Dostoyevsky are fond of gambling. The second one, in The Gambler, Polina gives some money to Alexis in order to gamble. At first, he gains money more than given, but at last he loses all the money he has, and he makes a deposit with Pauline's jewelry. In Dostoyevsky's life, he gambles thanks to Pauline's money. Even if he wins at first, he loses all the money he has in the end, and he makes a deposit of Pauline's jewelry too. Third one, Pauline is with Salvador before Dostoyevsky. Salvador, who is Spanish, young and rich, but he has Pauline on. In The Gambler, Pauline attaches importance to youth and visions like Pauline. Finally, there are many similarities between grandmother and Dostoyevsky's first wife. Both of them are patient, Auditorium, and stubborn people. Similar events between Dostoyevsky's life and The Gambler. Events in The Gambler take place in Paris and Ruletberg. Also, the relationship between Dostoyevsky and Pauline Suslova is located in Europe too. Dostoyevsky, who will meet Pauline in Paris, falls prey to his habit of gambling and gets off a train and goes to gamble at the railroad station in Wiesbaden. He gains 10,000 francs that night. After that, he goes back to the hotel and takes a ticket in order to go to Paris the next day. But he cancels his trip and goes back for gambling. He loses all of the money he has and decides to go back to Paris. There are some parts like that in The Gambler. For instance, when grandmother Blanca comes to France, he goes to the railroad station with Alexis to gamble. She gains 12,000 florins that night and goes back home. After that day, she goes again, but this time she loses all of the money and she decides to go back to Russia. But she cancels her ticket and sells her own bonds cheaply in order to gamble. She loses again and goes back to Russia too. Sinekli Bakkal by Halide Adıvar. Texts of literature are not affected by not only the psychology of a writer, but also the effects of the society on the writer. Halide Adıvar's novel called Sinekli Bakkal is studied and the social problems that are dealt with are confirmed. The novel contains important social problems such as East and West conflict, religion, art, tradition, family, slavery, moral degeneration, and politics. I want to show you some examples about writers' ideas and social problems in the novel which reflect in the real life. First one, Rabia, who was educated in both Eastern and Western cultures like Halide Adıvar, is a character in the novel. Her husband, Peregrine, had a Western education, but before getting married to Rabia, he became a Muslim. Halide shows us that marriage of two people from two different cultures is possible if they agree on other issues. Actually, Halide gives a message which is about ideal marriage, because she was unlucky in her first marriage. Second one, Rabia receives verses from Quran almost every day. One day, Peregrine asks her about their meaning, but Rabia doesn't know their meaning. Halide had an experience like that in her work. In her work, Mor Salkımlı Ev, which is an autobiographical novel. Third one, there are different values between Eastern and Western cultures. For instance, one day Peregrine wants to go to a cafe and wants to inform his wife Rabia about it. But Rakım, who was educated in Eastern tradition, warns him about not to ask for a permission from his wife. It shows the different conceptions of women's value in different cultures. Fourth one, another difference is about clothes. For instance, when Rabia leaves home the first time, she wears a veil and old clothes, like Halide Adıvar. But when she comes to Shaky Bey's mansion, she sees that her best friend Canaria, who is a character in the novel, wears modern clothes. It is about their growing style. Lastly, I want to show you some videos which are parts of Sinekli Bakkal.
Dargın aldık koydular. Emine bütün sevgisiyle yavrusunu büyüttü. İlhami Hoca, torununun ilk tahsilini kendi eline aldı. Ve daha ilk derslerde kızın bambaşka bir mahir olduğunu anlattı. Namaz kuvvetini bu kadar çabuk ezberleyen bir hafız henüz görmemişti.
To sum up, each text of literature can give information to us about different human worlds. The important thing is about knowing how we can analyze these novels. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Aysem, for your presentation. Our third presenter is Selda Saraç. She was born in Zonguldak. She is a senior student in English Language and Literature Department at Bilkent University. She is also pursuing a minor degree in political science. Her fields of interest are modernism, postmodernism, feminist theory, and romantic poetry. After graduation, she is planning to pursue an academic career in the field of English literature. The title of her paper, Live or Die, and Sexton's Journey Through Madness.
Hello everyone, I will talk about Anne Sexton and the cause of madness in her poetry. Here is the title of my paper, Live or Die, Anne Sexton's Journey Through Madness. And Sexton, one of the most accomplished and courageous poets in the context of American poetry in the 60s, is known for her emotional disturbances and personal tragedy. As a confessional poet, the cause of her troubled mind and chaotic life finds its voice in her poetry. Her honesty about her mental breakdowns and powerful autobiographical ethos gives Sexton's poems authenticity. In fact, and Sexton articulates that the most interesting poetry derives itself from personal experience. Quote, "Need to make form from the chaos," unquote, determines the style of her poetry. Therefore, it is hard to discuss the essence of Sexton's poetry without making references to her personal life. Correspondingly, I will explore the reasons that may have driven Sexton into madness by examining the intimate but depressive details of her life. In the essay, I will concentrate on the 4 volumes of Sexton's poetry, which are To Bedlam and Parçalayacak, All My Pretty Ones, Live or Die, and Transformations. Each volume includes poems that reveal Sexton's psychological fragmentation and paranoia. To Bedlam and Parçalayacak, published in 1960, is the first volume of Anne Sexton's poetry. Therefore, it is a key for readers to understand her poetic style and the themes that she will touch upon in her later poems. Sexton says that poems in the Bedlam volume were all about her own madness. As Sexton sincerely confesses, she is herself the persona of her poems. Before analyzing her poetry in the Bedlam volume, it is essential to cast our eyes over Sexton's tragedy. Maxim Kumit, Sexton's lifelong friend, says that Sexton's erratic behavior and her sudden mood changes stem from her depressive childhood experience. And her stated herself that her parents didn't want her from the very beginning. Her sisters were always hostile to her and her teachers were not patient with her. People failed to understand her true nature. Consequently, her reaction to disdain and social exclusion determined the content of her poetry. Moreover, her postpartum depression, hospitalization and attempt suicide formed the backbone of To Bedlam and Parçalayacak. The volume consists of poems that feelings of melancholy, desperation, anguish, and shame pervade. The opening poem, You, Dr. Martin, takes place in a bedroom. It unfolds the psychological depths of a patient who is indeed Anne Sexton herself. The poem begins with a description of Dr. Martin's walk from breakfast to madness. As a sane man, Dr. Martin comes to deal with the mental challenge after his breakfast. Sexton puts a distance between her sane doctor and the patients by depicting images from his ordinary life. Furthermore, her use of unconventional imagery reflects her mental state. Sexton compares the hospital to an, quote, antiseptic tunnel, where the moving dead still talk of pushing their bones against the trust of cure, unquote. Antiseptic is the very word to describe the atmosphere of the hospital as it represents sanitation and cleanliness. Sexton suggests that the asylum gives patients a chance to clear their minds and recover from their mental problems. However, tunnel signifies darkness that the patients are exposed to during the process of recovery. Sexton's comparison of patients to moving dead reveals her dissatisfaction with her condition. As the poem continues, we observe that Sexton feels herself superior to other patients. As she says, quote, I am the queen of this summer hotel, unquote. She implied that she is in the process of recovery. Her frequent use of summer hotel for asylum is rather remarkable in that it displays her contradictory nature and inconsistent feelings regarding the hospital. Sexton provides her readers with descriptions of daily routines as well. She makes moccasins to keep herself busy. Nevertheless, she asks herself that, am I still lost at the very end of the poem? She associates the idea of lostness with her mental breakdown, but the poem is hopeful as Sexton accepts her condition and indicates that she is on her way to recovery. The double image, which Anne Sexton calls, quote, 200 odd lines of confession and art, unquote, discloses astounding details about family relations. The poem is in a form of dramatic monologue, in which Sexton addresses her 4-year-old daughter, Joyce. Moreover, she talks about the dynamics of the relationship with her own mother. As for her own experience of motherhood, it is indeed a devastating experience for Sexton, as she says, quote, motherhood was overwhelming, unquote. Furthermore, she was not ready for a second child when she gave birth to Jones. Sexton's rage and resentment, combined with sorrow for the loss of her many to whom she was deeply attached, drove her into depression and she was again hospitalized. She uncovers the most private and intimate details of her delicate condition in the double image. A sense of guilt pervades the poem. Sexton is regretful of her attempt suicide because it has put a distance between her and Jones. She confesses that she has heard voices that dragged her into madness. Ugly quote. Ugly angels spoke to me. The blame, I heard them say, was mine. They tattled like grim witches in my head, letting doom leak like a broken faucet. As if doom had flooded my belly and filled your basement. And of that I must assume. Unquote. The lines help us define the symptoms of Sexton's madness and identify the causal effects. Sexton subconsciously blames herself as she was separated from her daughter Joyce for almost 3 years. Joyce couldn't recognize Sexton as her mother when she first met her. That experience immensely brought grief to Sexton's life. She held herself responsible for the separation between her and Joyce. The next stanza of the poem unravels the motivation behind her suicide as she puts, quote, I let the witches take away my guilty soul, unquote. That was the only way to overcome the unbearable sense of guilt for Sexton. However, suicide deepened Sexton's feelings of shame and guilt, as it further caused alienation between Sexton and her own mother. Sexton blames herself for her mother's death as well. Quote, only my mother grew ill. She turned from me as if death were catching, as if death transferred, as if my dying had eaten inside of her. On the 1st of September, she looked at me and said I gave her cancer. After her mother's death, Sexton attempted a second suicide as she was immensely in a depressive mood. She expresses her regret and guilt towards the end of the poem. She defines herself as a selfish woman who gave birth to a girl to cure or soothe her own madness. However, she felt that she failed both as a mother and as a daughter. All My Creative Ones, the second volume of poetry Sexton published, shows thematic similarity with the Belgian volume. However, Sexton distinguishes two volumes slightly from each other as she says, quote, I was given the experience of madness in Belgian volumes. In All My Creative Ones, she focuses on the reasons of her madness. The volume is dedicated to Sexton's deceased family members. Along with the themes of death, lament, and abortion, Sexton's surgery to remove ovary and her experience of poetry underlie the poems in All My Creative Ones. The operation is about the surgery Sexton had to undergo to remove her ovarian cyst. She associates her experience with her mother's death as she died of breast cancer. The sense of fear dominates the poem. Sexton successfully transmits her fear of sharing the same fate with her mother to her readers. The poem does not only reveal her psychological vulnerability, but it also enlightens us about the depths of her mind. She depicts the process and how it has made her realize that death is close. Quote, clean off the body's hair, I lie smooth from breast to leg. All that was special, all that was rare, is common here. Fact, death too is in the egg. Fact, the body is done, the body is meat. Lying on the operating table in a complete state of weakness, Sexton indeed finds out that death depreciates everything. The human body is nothing more than a flesh, deprived of soul and mind. The operation is obviously another traumatic experience for Sexton. As the poem continues, her infinite sense of loss and destitution reveals itself. She calls her mother at the dying door. Quote, God knows I thought I would die, but here I am, recalling mother, the sound of her, good morning, the odor of orange and jam. Unquote. The operation makes her as vulnerable as a child and triggers her longing for her mother and childhood memories. The Black Art, which is the last poem of All My Creative Ones, reveals the delicate condition of a poet. Confessional poetry particularly deals with paranoia and mental breakdown. Sexton embraces her madness as she comments in stanza 1. A woman who writes is too much, lost trances and portents, as if cycles and children and islands weren't enough, as if mourners and gossips and vegetables were never enough. Along with the tragic chain of events, her poetry experience brought about psychological problems. However, it is a deliberate choice for Sexton to sacrifice herself for the sake of creativity and imagination. That is why she readily accepts her condition in this poem. Moreover, as the poem continues, she acknowledges that poets have sharper sense and sensitivity. Therefore, it is not possible for them to live an ordinary life. They never love themselves and their eyes are filled with, quote, terrible confessions, unquote. Sexton argues that an artist can surrender herself to madness in order to reflect emotional depths in her poetry. Therefore, she assumes responsibility for her own madness. Live or Die, Sexton's third published volume of poetry, consists of even more confessional poems. Sexton perseveres in such themes as death, guilt, suicide, and madness again. However, we also notice that there are poems in which Sexton dwells on a life wish. She concedes that death is not a solution and tries to understand the destructive nature of the self. The title of the volume, Live or Die, indicates Sexton's strive not to yield to her desire of death. Along with her struggle and obsession with death, Sexton handles feminine angst and society pressure that induces psychological problems for her. In Wanting to Die, Sexton lays stress on her self-destructive nature and her ambivalent approach to death. The poem begins with a confession as Sexton says that, quote, the unnameable lust, quote, unquote, which presents her wish to die, returns. As the poem continues, she refers to her suicide attempts and accepts that it is her enemy. Quote, twice I have so simply declared myself, have possessed the enemy, eaten the enemy, have taken on his craft, his magic. She also acknowledges that suicide is a betrayal of body and soul. The poem shows Sexton's awareness regarding the evil nature of death. Yet it is not completely easy for her to get rid of the yoke of death, as she says. Suicides have a special language. Another poem that explores Sexton's confused state of mind is For the Year of the Insane, in which the speaker talks about the divided self. The speaker experiences alienation, as she says, quote, I see myself as one would see another. I have been cut into, unquote. She describes her condition in a very explicit but violent way. Moreover, she asks for forgiveness and turns towards religion as she states that although she is, quote, ugly, submerged in her own past and her own madness, she begs to Mary to give her praise. The poem indeed explores Sexton's motivation to find her true self, despite the fact that death and self-division pervade her poems. Caroline Bernard Hall interprets Sexton's ambivalent attitude towards death and madness. Quote, dying may be represented by drowning, by destructive memory, by the forgetfulness of electrical voltage. Life may be found in prayer, Mary, angels, and the notion of losing oneself to find oneself. Unquote. Regarding feminine angst, Self in 1958 unveils Sexton's resentment of male authority. She describes herself as a prisoner who has been trapped in domestic sphere and questions the reality created for women by society. She refers to herself as a cluster girl who lives in a doll's house carrying out feminine duties. She criticizes male authority and indicates that her true personality is quite different from people's perception of her. She says, quote, someone plays with me, lends me an old electric kitchen, or puts me upon their straight bed. They think I am me, unquote. Sexton reveals one of the woman's deepest dilemmas and hints that it leads to her personality disorder. She feels entrapped by society's expectations of women. Phyllis Chester in Woman and Madness suggests, quote, what we consider madness, whether it appears in woman or in man, is either the acting out of the devolved female role or the total or partial rejection of one's sex role stereotype. Transformation, in which Sexton reshapes Greece fairy tales, uncover hidden feelings and struggles of her own childhood. Freud suggests that some individuals tend to associate their childhood memories with events in the fairy tales. Sexton herself says, quote, "It will be further a lie to say that they weren't about me, because they are as much as about me as my other poetry," unquote. She uses the fairy tales to discover her own personality. Many of the poems reveal Sexton's gloomy side. She identifies herself as a witch in the Gold Key, quote, "The speaker in this case is a middle-aged witch, me," unquote. As Caroline Hall suggests, quote, "The poet writer witch characterizes herself as different, misunderstood, and possessed, as one who transforms the ordinary domestic scene into something weird and nightmarish, who pays for her imaginative powers with her sanity, or even with her life," unquote. Sexton refers to herself particularly in the prologues. In The Frog Prince, the speaker states, quote, "You are my judge, you are my jury, my gifts are what we catalog," unquote. Likewise, the speaker of Red Riding Hood describes herself as a deceiver, quote, "Many are the deceivers, and I too, quite collected at cocktail parties. Meanwhile, in my head, I'm undergoing open heart surgery," unquote. She cannot escape the sense of guilt. Sexton explores complex family relationships in the poems that appear in Transformations as well. In One Eye, Two Eyes, Three Eyes, the speaker lays stress on the cruelty of parents and refers to her unresolved childhood issues. Quote, "The parents have bizarre thoughts like a skilled sword. They accuse your grandfather, your bad sperm, your evil ovary," unquote. Sexton hints that she was brought up in an unknown environment that had caused her so much trouble throughout her life. In conclusion, Sexton's recurrent depressions, unconscious behavior, and secret rage shaped her life and her poetry experience. Her problematic relationship with her own mother, the anxiety of motherhood, the loss of her nanny, and her confinement in a domestic role led to mental breakdowns and psychological fragmentation. However, she shattered troubles by writing honestly about her experience of madness. Although she failed to cope with her personal troubles in her own life, she addressed the problems of women and paved the way for women poets. Thank you.
Thanks for your paper, Selda. Now we will continue with the discussions. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Hi, thanks for 3 really fascinating papers. I had a question for Taylan in particular, if I may. I was intrigued by your paper when I saw it on the programme. It was one of the first ones I put a star by to say I must hear that one. It's an intriguing topic.
Yeah, I hope I fulfilled your expectations.
Yeah, well, maybe you went beyond them. But I think, firstly, I wondered whether perhaps you overstate part of your case.
I have a tendency to defend overstatement.
I mean, I think it's often a very useful thing to do. But you argued, I think, at the conclusion of your paper that we still have a tendency to see these 3 figures as, I think your expression was, fanatics with problems. And I think there is a degree of truth to that. But I wonder if an even greater danger is perhaps not that we see them as fanatics, that we marginalise them as mad, but that actually we lose something of the mad genius of all 3, that they get somehow assimilated. To give an example, I'm thinking in particular of William Blake and a poem like Jerusalem, which has become this sort of alternative English national anthem, the song of the establishment of the Church of England. You hear it sung at rugby matches, which, you know, I can only think what William Blake would have made of that scene. And I wonder if with all three writers, you know, it's actually the fact that they've been included in mainstream.
I think they're included in the mainstream, but at first academia sterilized them.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they're being sterilized by mainstream academia. I witnessed it in my university, in a summer school in Crete. Well, for example, we talked about pounds about an hour, mm-hmm. but nobody even mentioned about his anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, let me say, or his stance against financial system. Mm-hmm. They just sterilized him and talked about his artistic approach. Mm-hmm. So I think we cannot divide their message from their personality and needs.
I'm sorry, I'm just waiting to see if somebody else comes back. I mean, I think you're right, and I think perhaps, I mean, certainly maybe I'm guilty of that myself, in that I'm teaching a course on contemporary 20th century British poetry. I've included a little Ezra Pound on that course. But to put it from the lecturer's perspective, perhaps, partly, you know, if you have 1 hour to talk about Ezra Pound, there's only so much you can do. And I think, you know, certainly for me, what's most valuable in Ezra Pound is perhaps not the
cantos.
Well, I think, again, I mean, the cantos is another question, because if you only have 1 hour, the cantos are such an enormous beast to try and sort of even begin to talk about, but it's
a hard labor.
It's much easier to take something much shorter. So yeah, I'm not even sure if I'm agreeing with you or disagreeing with you here, but I think there's another side to it, perhaps.
Yeah. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did. I mean, the other thing I wondered about with Ezra Pound in particular is, I mean, again, the sort of argument about Ezra Pound's sanity or insanity, the fact that a diagnosis of insanity of psychosis.
He was diagnosed with catatonia.
Yeah, but I think this was used. It was his lawyer who actually said, you know, this man is mad, because otherwise he may have been at risk of execution for treason.
You remember that I talked about his conditions? Mm-hmm. When he was caged in Pisa, he was forced to defecate on this ground. He sleeps so well. His lawyer may have used it, but still, the current American intelligentsia saw Ezra Pound as a psychotic.
But
I actually heard it from one of my lecturers.
A lecturer described Ezra Pound as psychotic?
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
Well, thinking of the Americans in that perspective, the lectures that you've just talked about, I think it's, you know, if I were to empathize with them, although I disagree with their point of view, it would be much easier to write off someone as a madman and disregard their political ideas than actually come up with a deconstructive argument against them. So, although initially Ezra Pound's lawyer might have used his madness as a defense to his, you know, so-called treason, in the end it served better to the purpose of his opposers, in that they took it for granted that he is not credible.
Yeah. Actually, I remember watching an interview of Ezra Pound with Pierpaolo Pasolini, an Italian director. Well, he looked to me quite sane. He was a person with a profound knowledge and a sane attitude. So I don't think we cannot categorize them as mad persons or people with problems. I think the society or the environment which they lived in was much more horrid than their own madness. So the whole my point was to expose it.
I think part of the problem with Pand as well is, you know, he was clearly anti-Semitic. I think it went beyond anti-Zionism, and this is something he sort of admitted himself at the end of his life. And when if you're teaching him particularly, you can be very aware of how students may be likely to reject a writer, and so as a lecturer, it's tempting to, move out, leave out elements like that when you're presenting a poet. You're anxious for students to engage with.
Can I add something? Anti-Semitism, Ezrapon's anti-Semitism was very different than Nazi anti-Semitism. He was not against the existence of Israelis or Jews as an entity, but his anti-Semitism was rather rooted in his stance against financial elite, which deforms American mindset at that age.
And I think that's another example where Ezra Pound's financial theories are, firstly very complex, and this is something I've read a fair amount on and I'm very interested in, but ultimately I'm aware I'm not an economist, and I don't have the intellectual skills to really engage with that. And I don't know. I think,
but still, Pound's economics, well, they basically depended on the Republican agrarian principles of American nation. Well, during the beginning of the 20th century, they were reversed. So his was a stance against it, I think.
But I think from what I understand from people who know more about this than I do, his economic theories are pretty up the wall. He's clearly identifying a genuine problem, but his proposed solutions are problematic, to put it mildly.
Well, if the people or the oligarchy, let me say, if it does not want to implement a policy, automatically they will label it as up to wall. So I don't know, maybe let's remember about 36 in Barcelona. Anarchists pretty improved the situation in Barcelona, and their economics succeeded there. But nobody knows about it because Franco's fascism, financed by British and American elite, devoured it.
Well, in my defence, I can say I've been teaching about Spain and 1936 at least. Sorry, I feel like I could go on, but this is maybe turning into a private conversation, and maybe we can...
We are stealing from our friends. So.
I have other questions for other people.
Any other questions?
Sorry, I don't want to dominate this. But I had a question for Selda. Again, thanks, it was a very interesting, stimulating paper. But the question that I always find myself asking of a poet like Anne Sexton, or Sylvia Plath, who we heard about yesterday, is how would it change your reading of the poems if a professor or a researcher today discovered that actually these poems weren't by Anne Sexton at all? They were written by a grumpy old male professor. What happens to our reading at that point?
I think it will totally change if there was such a thing. I don't know, I didn't really think about it before, but I don't think there will be such a thing, because as a female student, I sense the essence of this female anxiety in Sexton's or Sylvia Plath's file. So it will be very surprising for me if such a thing happens, and it will totally change my reading.
I mean,
I approach with such a, I approach differently this kind of, to this kind of poems.
it's a difficult question, I think, and I'm
Yes,
sorry
I
to...
never told it before.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I instinctively agree with you, I think, but I do wonder, I can't sort of justify my response very easily, because there are so many examples in literature of women ventriloquizing, speaking in a male voice, very, very convincingly, or vice versa, male writers writing in the voice of a woman.
Speaking, I'm sorry to interrupt you, speaking in the, first the women speaking in the name of the women, or the women speaking in the name of the man. For instance, George Eliot. George Eliot is not in fact a male figure. It's a female, but still due to the strict norms of patriarchy, she chooses a male pseudonym, for instance.
And I think George Eliot's a nice example as well, because for me, a novel like, I don't know if anyone knows Romola,
Middlemarch, Adam Bede.
That's the one of the most insightful portrayals of male psychology I've ever come across, and it's written by a woman.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, I don't know where we go.
I think Virginia Woolf is very successful in reflecting male psychology, but Sexton and Sylvia Plath is focus more on their own psychology and female psychology.
Okay, any more questions or comments? If not, I end this session.
Good for you.